In Part 2 of The Technological Republic, Alex Karp and Nicholas Zamiska share their view that the American minds have been hollowed out. The Western civilization history was reformed, there was increasing scrutiny over academics and business leaders who stood up for their opinions unlike before. This has led to a lack of strong opinions and instead have become agnostic. As a result, Silicon Valley companies have turned to focusing on consumer-oriented products in the toyland instead of thinking about innovation that would help national security and welfare. Karp then shares that Palantir has always had a strong commitment to protecting national security of the West. Since in Part 2, Karp and Zamiska outline what has been lost in the last decades, Part 3 goes on to explain what needs to be done, starting with the engineering mindset. Chapter 10, The X-Swarm. Chapter 10 starts with an example of a behavior seen in bees. In June 1951, Martin Lindauer, an entomologist, observed a swarm of bees in a Munich park. He was fascinated by the ability of honeybees to organize themselves without a central authority. As he watched the bees scout for a new nest, he noticed an intricate voting system at play. Certain individual scouts flew out to look for a new nest for the rest of the bees. These bees would return to the swarm and perform their own waggle dance to indicate potential nesting sites. The length and direction of the dance correlated to the distance and orientation of the new nest site relative to the sun. Over several hours, the swarm of bees debated and mimicked the dance of the bees whose nest site they preferred. Eventually, the nest location that was preferred was voted by the bees, coalescing around the scout bee whose site they voted for. This coordination was devoid of hierarchy. Instead, Lindauer's findings suggested that decision-making within the swarm was emergent in a decentralized manner rather than dictated. Lindauer and his colleague Karl von Frisch later won a Nobel Prize for work on bee communication. The broader implications of the X-swarm extend beyond bees. Giorgio Parisi's study of starling murmurations revealed similar decentralized coordination where movements originate from the birds at the edges of the flock, relaying information inward almost instantaneously. Unlike rigid corporate hierarchies, these natural systems function fluidly, prioritizing adaptability and information sharing over bureaucratic layering. The insight that decision-making should be distributed rather than centralized would later influence the ethos of engineering cultures, particularly in the startup world. Chapter 11, The Improvisational Startup. The engineering mindset parallels improvisational theater. Startups like Palantir has also embraced this concept. New hires at Palantir were given Keith Johnston's Improvisation and the Theater, a book originally intended for actors but deeply relevant to startups. The book explores how having layers of status shape human interactions. This kind of hierarchical rigidity stifles creativity. Traditional corporate structures, like those of mid-century American conglomerates, enforced hierarchy to the point of absurdity, where even office furniture was dictated by one's rank. By contrast, Palantir aimed to cultivate a dynamic, fluid structure, rejecting rigid authority in favor of flexibility. While Karp acknowledges that there needs to be some hierarchy instead of an all-flat org structure, employees were encouraged to identify gaps and take initiative. Status dynamics in traditional businesses often inhibit innovation. Johnston, drawing on the zoologist Konrad Lorenz's observations, noted that dominant jackdaws barely acknowledged lower-ranking birds. The same holds true for corporate environments, where status signaling prevents meritocratic ideas from rising. By de-emphasizing hierarchy and fostering improvisation, companies can maximize creative problem-solving. If you watch interviews of Karp, he always mentions that Palantir's core culture is meritocracy. Chapter 12, The Disapproval of the Crowd. In Chapter 12, Karp and Zamiska share a few famous experiments that are stark reminders of how humans are susceptible to groupthink. In a 1951 experiment, Solomon Asch gathered groups of participants and presented them with a simple task, comparing the lengths of lines on a card. Each participant was shown a reference line alongside 3 comparison lines, one of which clearly matched in length while the others were either too short or too long. The catch? Only one person in each group was a true test subject. The remaining participants were instructed to intentionally give the wrong answer in order to see if the test subject would conform. Time and again, Ash found that many subjects, despite knowing the correct answer, would go along with the majority. Faced with unanimous but obviously incorrect responses from the group, subjects second-guessed their own perception and chose conformity over truth. This experiment demonstrated how powerful social pressure can be, revealing that individuals often prioritize fitting in over objective reasoning. This insight was later reinforced by Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments in the 1960s. Milgram set up a scenario in which participants, believing they were part of a study on learning, were instructed to administer increasingly severe electric shocks to another person. This other person was actually an actor and wasn't really being shocked. With each incorrect answer, the supposed voltage increased, and the actor would scream in pain, beg to stop, or eventually fall silent. Despite hearing these distressing reactions, 2/3 of participants continued delivering shocks simply because an authority figure, a researcher in a white lab coat, told them to. Milgram's most chilling finding was that most subjects obeyed authority figures despite clear moral qualms. However, a few resisted. One particularly notable case was a German medical technician who had lived through the rise of the Nazi Party. As the voltage increased, she calmly refused to continue, stating matter-of-factly, "Sorry, I think when shocks continue like this, they're dangerous." Unlike others who struggled with their choices, she did not hesitate. This quiet defiance underscores a vital lesson. Those who resist blind conformity are often the most crucial contributors to innovation. In startups and engineering-driven companies, cultivating a culture where individuals are encouraged to challenge directives rather than blindly follow is essential for meaningful breakthroughs. Startups and engineering-driven companies must actively cultivate this kind of constructive disobedience. Palantir's success came, in part, from fostering a culture that challenged directives. An unquestioning workforce is detrimental to organizations aiming for breakthroughs. Engineers must be willing to challenge assumptions, even if doing so invites social friction. Chapter 13, Building a Better Rifle. This agile engineering mindset was clearly missing in the government bureaucracy during the war in Afghanistan. Despite possessing vast amounts of intelligence, prior attack data, bomb-making materials, suspect profiles, the Army's fragmented systems prevented effective decision-making. The military's own software solution, years in the making, failed to meet the urgent needs of the soldiers on the ground. At the same time, U.S. soldiers faced a major threat: roadside bombs, or IEDs, improvised explosive devices. These were made with fertilizers and only cost a couple of $100s to make. They had claimed many lives of U.S. soldiers and civilians. The military had access to a vast amount of intelligence on these bombs, including previous attack locations and profiles of suspected bomb makers, but the Army's outdated software system made it difficult to analyze all this information in a useful way. In contrast, Palantir's intelligence platform provided a streamlined approach, synthesizing disparate data into actionable insights. Yet, resistance from military red tape made it impossible for its adoption by the soldiers in the field. Some intelligence officers circumvented standard procurement processes, appealing directly to senior officials for Palantir's software. One officer wrote bluntly, "We aren't going to sit here and struggle with an ineffective intel system while we're in the middle of a heavy fight taking casualties." Despite these pleas, the Army refused to adopt Palantir's system. In 2016, Palantir took legal action, suing the U.S. government. They argued that the Army was violating the law by failing to consider commercial software solutions already available in the market before developing its own. As an aside, this law was enacted by Bill Clinton during the Gulf War. The Army needed many two-way radios, the ones that could be bought at local electronic retailers like Radio Shack for $20, but the government bureaucratic procurement process required Motorola, the maker of the two-way radio, to build them from scratch following required guidelines by the U.S. government, and Motorola refused. To circumvent this backwards procurement rule, the US government asked the Japanese government to buy the commercially available two-way radios, and the US government bought them from the Japanese government. As a result of this unnecessary mess, Clinton and Al Gore reformed the 1994 Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act, mandating that agencies consider commercially available solutions before developing in-house alternatives. The lawsuit hinging on this act resulted in a major victory for Palantir, forcing the Army to open up its intelligence software procurement process to outside companies. This case highlighted a key problem in large organizations: resistance to outside innovation even when better solutions exist. Chapter 14, The Cloud or a Clock. Modern technological revolutions are defined by flexible adaptation rather than rigid planning. Isaiah Berlin's classic distinction between foxes and hedgehogs are likened to startups. Startups have a fox-like pragmatism, who know many things rather than hedgehogs, who know one big thing. One example of flexible thinking comes from a senior executive at Toyota, Taiichi Ohno's The 5 Whys technique from the late 1970s. This technique exemplifies the engineering mindset of getting to the root cause. Palantir also uses this method to analyze a problem. For example, if a software update deployment fails, the first question might be, why was the deadline missed? The update was not shipped by the Friday deadline because the team had only 2 days to review the draft code. Why did the team only have 2 days to review? Because the team had lost 6 software engineers in the budget review cycle late last year. Why did the budget decrease? Because the head of the group shifted priorities at the request of another group lead. Why was the request made by the group lead to shift priorities? Because a new compensation model had been rolled out which incentivized growth in certain areas and not others. Why were only certain areas selected to grow? Because of an ongoing feud between 2 senior executives. This kind of deeper inquiry might reveal systemic issues: budget cuts, misaligned incentives, leadership conflicts. Identifying core failures rather than superficial fixes is essential for long-term success. In tech, unconventional thinkers, often dismissed by the establishment, drive breakthroughs by challenging conventional wisdom. In software engineering, failures are immediate and irrefutable. Code either runs or doesn't. This unforgiving feedback loop fosters a culture of ruthless pragmatism. The best founders and engineers share this fox-like adaptability rather than rigid theories. Summary and review of Part 3. The engineering mindset, as demonstrated in nature, military strategy, psychology, and software development, prioritizes decentralized decision-making, improvisation, iterative problem-solving, adaptability, creativity, and the ability to challenge directives with dissenting views. The challenge now is ensuring that this mindset does not remain siloed in startups, but is applied more broadly to the technological and societal landscape. What stands out to me most about this is the current geopolitical environment, particularly the new government's approach to relations with Russia. Karp has been vocal about supporting Ukraine and the West. His ability to adapt to changing circumstances reinforces his commitment to ensuring Palantir remains relevant and forward-looking. While Palantir maintains a long-term mission, it also has a fiduciary duty to its shareholders. Part of that responsibility is meeting financial targets and sustaining its growth trajectory, which includes securing government contracts at a pace that matches or exceeds the growth rates of recent years. Karp holds a doctorate in philosophy with a background in academia rather than software engineering or Silicon Valley tech culture. Despite this, he has remained steadfast in fostering a culture of meritocracy and a flexible, adaptable engineering mindset through his 2 decades of leadership at Palantir. In summary, Part 3 emphasizes that the engineering mindset thrives on adaptability, decentralization, and meritocracy, allowing organizations to innovate, solve complex problems, and stay ahead of changing circumstances. To remain competitive, both businesses and the government must embrace this approach, ensuring that decision-making prioritizes agility, creativity, and data-driven problem-solving over rigid hierarchies and outdated traditions. The final part of the book, Part 4, Technological Republic, We'll conclude the book with Karp and Zimiska's views on what needs to happen next. We are almost finished with the book now. As a Palantir investor myself, I've really been enjoying seeing into the depths of how Karp's mind works. I hope you've also been finding this helpful as well. Thanks for watching.